Hello and welcome to the Warframe tier list. Today we'll be going over Octavia, and first things first, let's go into the builds. So with Octavia, I have a single build, though there are a couple different things that you can do to it. So with Octavia, I choose to subsume Pillage over her second ability, as her second ability, Resonator, can actually be a detriment to Octavia's kit, as you want all of the enemies to be consistently hitting Mallet, and you also want your Mallet to be in direct line of sight as many enemies as possible. Resonator makes it so it is harder for enemies to hit your mallet, lowering your damage output, and it also picks mallet up and roams it around, putting it in undesirable locations. So I pretty much always subsume over Resonator, and even before the helmet system was out, I purposely opted out of ever casting this ability, as it was pretty obvious that it lowered your kills per minute. Pillage is incredibly useful in Octavia, as Octavia already has scaling damage thanks to her mallet, taking damage that enemies deal and redirecting it back to them. This means that the higher level the enemies, the more damage that you will do yourself. However, enemies' armor value does outscale the damage that they are dealing, and this is where Pillage comes in. Even without full stripping enemies, Pillage still makes it so you can scale all the way up to level cap even with relative ease, as this build has 200% ability strength thanks to having 108% base, Ult Augmented giving us a further 60%, and then Moderai giving us the last 40% from Sling Strength. Pillage requires 400% strength to full strip, and with this build we have 208%. That means that in 2 casts of Pillage you will full strip, and again, even in shorter missions, just half stripping enemies is completely fine. I am running a couple of flex mods here, like Overextended. With Octavia, I've played a lot of different range values as Octavia, and I change it up pretty much every time I play her. But I've recently settled on 190, but the lowest I would ever suggest going on the range department as Octavia is 175, and the highest I would ever suggest going is 235, because anything beyond that is really just meaningless. Duration is a flex slot, but you can drop Augur Message for Augur Reach if you're finding yourself wanting to have even more range. You'll see that in the footage that I'm showing later, I really didn't need Streamline and possibly even Flow, but the reason I run them is just so then I have some leeway, particularly whenever I'm not solo, as Octavia's KPM does falter off a bit in a group setting, as again her kit is like you really want as many enemies attacking the mallet as once, and you also want to be holding down an area, so if you're just playing with random people, like people just running everywhere or having somebody else nuking enemies, can lower your KPM as Octavia. So I like having Streamline and Flow just so that I always can sustain regardless of the content, rather than having a build designated for solo. That being said, with Archon Charge, you can very easily drop Flow and Streamline from the build in group content and solo, just for free. Now, as for the weapon loadout, I was using a miter. You can really use whatever you want, but I was just using a gas miter to help AoE enemies down. Uh, this is just the build. You can replace the Riven with really anything you want, something like Amalgam Serration, or I guess that's just it. You could use like Amalgam Serration or a what is that one thing called? Bladed Rounds. Bladed Rounds would also work here instead of the Riven. As for the secondary, I was using a Nucor with a single Augur mod. If you take off Streamline, you do not need this Augur mod at all. My Riven is Toxin plus Cold, so without this Riven, you would just replace the Riven with viral 60/60 mods like Frostbite, and then replace Scorch with the other one. As for the melee, I was using a Praetos for the parkour velocity and sprint speed, but other melees that do work well on Octavia are Zal weapons, as Exodia Contagion does double dip from her 4th ability, as her 4th ability gives a flat damage buff, which works kind of like a swap buff for Exodia Contagion. So if you like Exodia Contagion builds, Octavia is a good frame. Then there's the Companion. I was just running a standard Panzer build with the synth mods equipped. And last but not least, there is the Mandachord. Yeah, I'm just blind. The Mandachord was right here. So for the Mandachord, all three of these bars relate to three separate abilities. The percussion is for the mallet, the bass is for the resonator, and then the melody is for the metronome. Having a note in every single slot increases the consistency of these abilities, so I would highly recommend it. Having a note in every single slot makes it so it is easier to go invisible with metronome, and having one in every slot for mallet makes it so mallet deals its damage more often. It doesn't make it do more damage, though it does raise the consistency of how quickly you are killing enemies, and it also helps for dealing with nullifiers, as mallet does pop nullifier bubbles, so making it attack quicker will deal with them even faster. Now, moving on to the rankings, we're discussing Octavia in relation to four separate topics. Firstly, her KPM, secondly, her survivability, thirdly, her viability, and finally, how fun she is to play. All of this data is sampled from a 1-hour solo Steel Path Mont run with no Spectres, no on-call, and of course, no Archon shards. Now let's begin with the first topic, Octavia's KPM. I'll keep this short and sweet. Octavia's KPM is absolutely amazing. Even if you AFK and you just press her 1, your 4, and your 3, and then you don't bother shooting your guns at all, you just stay invisible and hide in a corner and let your mallet kill everything, you can still easily expect to get over 100 KPM, which is already pretty decent, especially for how minimal effort it is. However, if you actually try to play the game, and you either use your weapons to kill enemies, or use your mallet to hold off one corridor while you hold off another, or you spam Magus Anomaly for a grouping tool for your mallet, uh, particularly a grouping tool that doesn't CC enemies like most other grouping tools. That way the enemies are still shooting your mallet to redirect the damage to them. You can easily get 140 to 150 KPM pretty consistently on most tile sets in the game, and in edge case scenarios you can even get 175 to 190 KPM, like I am showing in this footage where I got 175, even though I did a full death around 50 minutes, which wasted a lot of time. She also has scaling potential built into her kit based on how her mallet works, which I explained earlier, where it just scales off of the enemy's damage. So the higher the level of the enemy, the more damage they'll deal, meaning the more damage that you will deal. Pair this with something with pillage, and that means that you can easily scale to level cap without even faltering in the KPM department too much, as, well, you're also armor stripping them on top of them dealing increased damage. So, all in all, Octavia's KPM is absurd, and this isn't even mentioning the fact that she also buffs your weapons with her 4 and also her 3. These aren't small buffs either. Her 4 and her 3 buffs are insane. You get melee attack speed, you get multi-shot, and then you also get a flat damage buff from her 4. I will give Octavia's KPM rank an S+. Now moving on to the second topic, her survivability, and her survivability is also really good, despite me saying that I full died. If you die as Octavia, it is almost entirely your fault. Sometimes you'll just falter over, as you'll see. But honestly, I didn't watch the footage back, but when I died, I was kind of just confused. I was like, what just killed me? But realistically, you should almost never die as Octavia, because A, you're invisible, and like I've mentioned in almost every single video where I have a source of invisibility, invisibility is one of the strongest forms of survivability in the game, outside of outright invincibility. Then on top of this, you have your mallet, which draws enemy aggro away from you, increasing your survivability even further, and the fact that she's extremely easy to shield gate on, thanks to her relatively low base shields, her high energy pool, her passive giving her innate energy sustain, and really that's about it. Her survivability is high. One thing to note about her survivability is you should try not to stand on top of your mallet, as standing on top of your mallet means that even when you're invisible, you will get shot by other enemies, especially if they're using AoE weapons like bombards. That being said, there are times where you want to stand on top of your mallet, such as casting pillage. The reason for this is whenever you cast your mallet, you want to place it at a place where the mallet has direct line of sight to as many open corridors as possible. So whenever you cast Pillage, you also are going to want to be near your mallet, as Pillage also has line of sight checks, so you want your Pillage to hit as many enemies as possible as well. So basically just be mindful of where your mallet is and know when you're going to be stepping near it, and be ready to either reset your shield gate or use rolling guard, so that way you don't die. If you play her properly, you should essentially never die, and I will give her an S rank for her survivability as well. Now, moving on to the third topic, her viability, and her viability is also decent. Across the board, she is very slightly above average in most mission types. In survival, however, she is one of the best frames, if not the best frame, in the entirety of the game. Again, for pretty much all the reasons I've previously stated, the fact that you can play her as an AFK frame is incredibly useful for farming resources or steal essence. The fact that she has infinite scaling damage means that you can play her for however long you want. Again, especially if you're farming resources, you can just do an endless survival fissure as her and never worry about having KPM or survivability issues. She also has a very not noteworthy movement speed buff attached to her 3, but it is something that helps for non-endless missions. And she also does still have the multi-shot buff for those missions as well, to buff your weapons, which again doesn't really do all too much, because if you're using proper weapons, they should one-shot base star chart and base steel path enemies anyway. But if you're not completely modded out and kitted out, it still does help. And for Spy, she's my personal favorite Spy frame, as most other Invis frames have some kind of catch. Like, for example, Loki or Ashe, their invisibility is not recastable, so you can be seen for like a split second whenever your invisibility runs out before you cast it. Ivara obviously is slower whenever she's invisible, but Octavia can move full speed and can recast her invisibility, so she is my personal favorite Spy frame. Though, granted, she technically isn't the best, she is one of the better ones in my opinion. As for something like Disruption, she's also good there, though again not the best. You can set your mallet down to passively kill enemies while you're dealing with the Demolist to get additional keys, and then of course you also have all the weapon buffs to help you kill the Demolist, so I would say she's above average in Disruption as well. In open worlds, if you run higher range, like 235, she works there as well. So just across the board, she's either really good or above average, but she's really not the best anywhere, in my opinion, other than Survival and Spy. So for these reasons, I will give her an A+ rank for her viability. Now moving on to the final topic of is she fun to play, and I believe that this is the topic that sparks the most debate. In my opinion, I think people vastly over-exaggerate how boring Octavia is, and that they are really shooting themselves in the foot, as most people that say Octavia is boring just place her abilities and then go AFK. I feel like you can't really say that a Warframe is boring if that is all that you're playing her as. Now, obviously, she works that way, and you can do AFK farming as Octavia, but you can also play her in an active playstyle and be rewarded with significantly higher KPM, and then you'll also be rewarded with, fun, because you're playing the game and not just AFKing it. In the footage you're seeing, I'm getting 175 KPM, and if you just sat there and placed your 1, 3, and then 4, and then went AFK for like 30-40 seconds, came back and recasted everything, and stayed invisible, you would not get anywhere near that KPM. You would be getting like 110, maybe 120 at like the absolute highest. Now, that being said, even if you are actively playing her, it still isn't the most fun, as you're stuck spamming control for a large percentage of the mission, and spamming one button over and over again for an arbitrary reason is not exactly the most fun thing, and it can also lead to wrist pain. In fact, Octavia used to be my main frame back in like 2017, maybe 2018, but I had to stop playing her as she was just causing too much discomfort to play. That being said, if you play her in moderation, such as whenever I was recording this video, I only did one 1 hour run a day, and in fact I even had a couple days where I didn't do a 1 hour run, and it was just completely fine. Though the gameplay loop of spamming Magus Anomaly over and over again and then recasting the abilities and then maybe casting Pillage shooting your gun isn't the most fun, though there are a lot of other frames that that have like very similar playstyles where you're stuck spamming insert grouping tool here, then like just letting your abilities kill while you're spamming the grouping tool. So she's not really any less fun than them in my opinion. She just has the added downside of having to spam control while doing it. For these reasons, I will give her a C- rank for her fun. Now, again, that's not a high rank, despite me going to bat for her fun, but that is because I feel like most people will just give her an F, but again, I think that they are doing it to themselves, and if you play her properly, she really isn't that boring, and there are other frames in the game that are worse to play. In conclusion, Octavia is an A+ tier Warframe. However, if you do not care about the fun rank, or you yourself find her to be more fun, she is an easy S rank Warframe.